What if I told you British history can be traced, quietly, almost tenderly, by following where the monarch tried to sleep, not where they fought, not where they were crowned, but where they shut a door, warmed their hands, and listened for footsteps in the corridor? What if the story of England and Britain is also the story of rooms, smoky halls that stank of wet wool, bright new palaces built to impress, and fortresses that were, frankly, expensive ways to feel less afraid? Historical records, household accounts, and contemporary descriptions let us map these homes with surprising precision, right down to the kitchens, chapels, gardens, and the constant problem of keeping the roof from leaking. If you want more long, slow, detail-rich history for sleep or background listening, tap like, subscribe, and settle in. Tonight we'll take a quiet tour, monarch by monarch, through the places they called home and what those walls reveal about power, comfort, and the long, uneasy business of ruling. Alfred the Great and the hard-won safety of Winchester. Alfred's England is not an England of neat palaces and confident ceremony. It is an England of alarms, of coastlines watched for sails, of monasteries burned, of roads that can turn from travel to danger in a mile. When Alfred becomes King of Wessex in 871, home is less a single building and more a moving target, wherever the king can keep his household fed, his advisors close, and his enemies guessing. And yet Winchester matters. It sits inland, it has weight as a religious and administrative center, and it offers a sense of continuity when everything else feels temporary. In this period, a royal home is often a great hall with timber beams, a hearth that never quite defeats the damp, and a chapel where legitimacy is tended like a flame. Contemporary accounts and later traditions tie Alfred to places like Athelney, marshy refuge turned into a story of survival. But when you imagine his home life, picture less romance and more logistics. Grain stores, horse lines, messengers coming and going at odd hours. His legacy isn't a single glamorous residence. It's the idea that the kingdom itself can be organized like a household, defended, managed, and kept, room by room, against collapse. And as we drift forward, you'll notice something. The royal home keeps trying to become stable, and history keeps finding ways to shake it. Edward the Elder and the move between burhs. Edward the Elder inherits more than a crown in 899. He inherits an emergency system. The network of fortified burhs, strengthened under Alfred, isn't just military architecture. It becomes a chain of usable royal bases. A king who wants to be obeyed must be seen, and a king who wants to live must be protected. So Edward's home is often distributed. Winchester remains important, but the rhythm of rule includes movement between strong points, places with walls, stores, and loyal officials who can host the royal household without the entire operation collapsing into hunger and disorder. The domestic texture of this life is practical. Royal accommodation in this era is still hall-centered, communal, smoky, loud. Privacy exists, but not the way later monarchs will demand it. What matters is proximity. The king close to his warriors, his clerics, his scribes, and the constant stream of petitions. Official records and later chronicles emphasize Edward's campaigns and consolidation. But the quieter truth is the governance requires somewhere to sit down and open a document. The home becomes wherever the royal seal is pressed into wax, wherever the king's presence turns local authority into national command. By Edward's time, the royal household is beginning to feel like a machine, portable, repeatable, able to set itself up in a fortified town and run the kingdom from a table. And speaking of tables, wait until kings start demanding rooms designed purely to display them. Athelstan and the symbolic weight of a king's hall. When Athelstan rises to power in the early 10th century, he's not simply occupying a residence, he's occupying an idea. He becomes associated with the first truly English kingship in a way that later generations will cling to, and that symbolism changes how home is used. Winchester still matters, as do other royal centers, but Athelstan's household becomes a stage set for unity. The hall is where you gather nobles from different regions, where you receive gifts, where you make it obvious, through ceremony, through seating order, through who gets close, that the kingdom is becoming something larger than local loyalties. Contemporary documents show a world thick with charters and witnesses. Those witness lists, long strings of names, are not just bureaucratic trivia. They're the human architecture of power, assembled indoors. Athelstan's home is wherever he can gather the right people under one roof and make their presence serve his authority. Imagine the sensory detail: rushes on the floor, the smell of ale and meat, the scrape of benches, the mutter of translators if foreign envoys are present, and the steady patience of scribes. If earlier kings needed shelter, Athelstan also needs spectacle. Quiet, controlled spectacle, but spectacle nonetheless. Home becomes a political instrument, a place that says, "This is the center." And as the line continues, the royal home will keep absorbing new roles until it becomes its own kind of government. Edmund I and the fragile court. Edmund's reign begins in 939, and it carries a sense of precarious inheritance. Rivalries simmer, borders remain uncertain, and kingship still has the feeling of a man standing on a chair to be seen above a crowd that may or may not keep him standing. In such a world, a royal home cannot be complacent. The court moves, not only for tradition but for survival and control. Yet the pattern of royal centers, Winchester prominent among them, continues to anchor the kingdom's administrative habits. What does home look like here? It looks like people. The household is the structure. Trusted companions, clerics who can read and write, servants who can keep the king fed, and guards who watch doorways, as if the doorways are the true borders of the realm. Official records suggest the steady issuing of charters and legal decisions, and those activities require a kind of domestic stability. Tables, ink, storage, a rhythm of meals and meetings. Even when the court is itinerant, it tries to recreate familiarity, the same rituals, the same order of business, the same hierarchy expressed through proximity. Edmund's domestic world reminds us that a monarchy is always one illness, one betrayal, one bad winter away from chaos. A home is not a luxury. It is the workshop where authority is continuously repaired. And speaking of repair, wait for the moments when kings try to rebuild not just order, but the very places that order lives in. Edred and the monastic gravity of royal residence. Edred's reign, beginning in 946, sits in a landscape where monasteries and royal power are intertwined like roots. In this period, spiritual authority isn't merely decorative, it's structural. Monastic sites offer literacy, record-keeping, moral legitimacy, and often the closest thing to stable infrastructure. So royal home can lean into religious centers, not only because the king is pious, but because monasteries are among the best organized institutions available. When you imagine Edred's domestic environment, imagine proximity to prayer and parchment. Chapels aren't an add-on, they're central rooms. The royal hall still exists, still smokes, still hosts feasts and formal gatherings, but the atmosphere shifts with the presence of reform-minded clerics. The court is not merely a warrior camp with better cutlery. It becomes a place where law, land grants, and moral language shape the kingdom. Home also means a place to be ill. Edred is known to have struggled with health, and a sick king changes the geography of power. Rooms become quieter, access becomes more controlled. The bedchamber becomes political space. Who is admitted, who is turned away, who speaks in the king's ear. Domestic details, food prepared for illness, physicians or healers, the hush of corridors, become national issues because a monarch's body is part of the state. And as the crown passes, you'll see how often the royal home is shaped by something simple and unstoppable, the human need to be cared for. Edwig and the court as a battleground. Edwig's brief reign in the mid-10th century is remembered less for architecture than for tension between factions, between visions of rule, between the king's personal life and the expectations pressing in on him like walls. In this sense, home becomes a battleground. The great hall, the private chamber, the spaces where the king withdraws, these are not neutral. They are the settings for influence, confrontation, and the struggle over who belongs near the monarch. Accounts from later writers can be hostile and moralizing, and where details are uncertain or shaped by propaganda, it's worth acknowledging that. But even with disputed color, the pattern is clear. Royal domestic space matters because it controls access. In a world without modern ministries, power often flows through corridors. If you can get into the king's presence, you can shape decisions. If you can control who serves him, who advises him, who entertains him, you can shape the kingdom while calling it household routine. Imagine the textures: whispered conversations near doorways, alliances formed over meals, arguments disguised as concern for the king's dignity. Home is not restful here. It is crowded with watchers. Edwig's story warns that a palace or a hall doesn't automatically create authority. It can also concentrate conflict. And speaking of concentration, next comes a king whose reign will make royal spaces feel more unified, more deliberate, more designed. Edgar and the performance of order. Edgar's reign, beginning in 959, is remembered for consolidation and a kind of ceremonial confidence. If earlier kings lived in survival mode, Edgar's domestic world suggests something closer to planned governance. The royal home becomes less a shelter you happen to control, and more a place that communicates order. Royal centers like Winchester gain additional weight, not only as practical bases but as symbols. A king who appears in a structured court, supported by reformed monasteries, surrounded by disciplined officials, projects stability. And stability in a 10th century kingdom is a seductive promise. Domestic life in Edgar's court is still medieval in its communal intensity. You don't have endless private suites. You have halls, chambers, chapels, service areas, and a web of servants who make the household run. But the emphasis shifts toward regulation. Who sits where? Who speaks when? What rituals frame decisions? Contemporary records show the continuing importance of charters and lawmaking. Those documents are produced in domestic spaces. The room where ink is laid down becomes, in its own quiet way, as crucial as the battlefield. Imagine Edgar's home as a place where noise is managed, rather than merely endured. The clatter of a feast balanced by the hush of a chapel, the bustle of servants set against the controlled presence of officials. And as we glide onward, you'll notice royal home beginning to harden into something like a permanent institution, one that will survive the monarch who inhabits it. Edward the Martyr and the dangers inside the house. Edward the Martyr's short reign begins in 975, and the story that clings to him is one of vulnerability, of a young king caught in the sharp domestic politics of succession. When danger comes, it doesn't always come from the border. Sometimes it lives in the same building. The details around Edward's death are wrapped in later interpretation and sanctified narrative, and where certainty fades into tradition, it's best to say so. But the broader truth remains. Royal households are dangerous because they concentrate ambition. Home, for a young king, is a place where adults control the schedule, the access, the flow of information. It is also a place where loyalty can be performed in public and withdrawn in private. The halls and chambers that should provide protection can become traps if the people inside decide the crown belongs elsewhere. Imagine the domestic intimacy of medieval power. Shared meals, shared prayers, shared corridors. It's hard to hide hatred in a tiny court, but it's also hard to escape it. Edward's story underlines a grim principle. The closer you are to the throne, the more the home becomes a site of risk. Walls don't merely keep enemies out. They can keep the vulnerable in. And speaking of vulnerability, Wait for the reign where England's royal home becomes shadowed by fear, suspicion, and an almost administrative paranoia. Ethelred, the unready, and the court under pressure. Ethelred's reign begins in 978, and his domestic world is defined by pressure, Viking threats, political instability, and the desperate need to make decisions that will hold. In such a context, the royal home becomes a place of constant consultation, meetings, messengers, plans made and revised, payments calculated and regretted. Winchester remains crucial, and London grows in importance. But the deeper sense is that the court itself is under strain. A household can only function if it can feed itself and protect itself. When raids and insecurity widen, even the kitchen becomes political. Supplies, taxes, tribute, these are domestic issues scaled up to national survival. Official records, law codes, and charters from Ethelred's time show governance trying to keep its shape. But the mood shifts. The court is no longer a confidence center. It's a command post, sometimes frantic, sometimes brittle. Imagine a hall where the conversation never fully relaxes. The laughter at a feast feels slightly forced because everyone is listening for news. The king's private chamber becomes a place where anxiety is contained until it leaks into policy. Home, here, is also symbolic. A king must appear steady even if the kingdom isn't. The household rituals, formal meals, religious observances, gift-giving become a kind of spell, an attempt to make order real by acting it out. And then inevitably comes a moment when the home changes hands entirely, when new rulers walk in and try to make England feel like theirs. Cnut and the foreign king's English home. Cnut becomes king in the early 11th century, and his home story is one of adaptation. He is a conqueror, yes, but he is also a ruler who understands something important. You don't truly control a kingdom until you can live in it like you belong there. So Cnut's royal residences are English centers, Winchester, London, and the established sites of governance, made to serve a Danish king who needs English legitimacy. The household becomes a blending of cultures, different languages, different traditions, different assumptions about loyalty and reward. Contemporary records show Cnut engaging with the English church and administration, and those engagements happen indoors, across tables, inside chapels, within the social choreography of court. A king's home is where he is seen as king by the people whose recognition matters. Imagine the scene. English clerics watching a foreign ruler perform English kingship, Danish companions gauging English customs, servants trying to anticipate unfamiliar preferences in food, dress, and ceremony. Home also becomes a propaganda tool. If the king can appear settled, devout, orderly, richly housed, then conquest begins to feel like continuity. The hall becomes a stage for the message. The kingdom has not ended, it has been absorbed. Cnut's domestic story is a reminder that a palace isn't just shelter, it's a language, and the smartest rulers learn to speak it fluently. And speaking of fluency, next comes a sequence of short reigns, where the royal home feels less like a settled language and more like a borrowed coat. Harold Harefoot and the temporary feel of power. Harold Harefoot's reign in the 1030s carries a sense of impermanence. The crown sits uneasily contested, and the court reflects that tension. A royal home under such conditions is not a place of ease. It's a place where everyone is measuring everyone else, gauging how long the current arrangement will last. The established centers, London, Winchester, and the broader network of royal estates remain available, but the emotional tone shifts. When legitimacy is questioned, domestic routines become political theater. Who visits the king? Who is seen at his table? Which churchmen offer public support? Which nobles keep their distance? Imagine a household that feels slightly rearranged, as if furniture has been moved in a hurry. The same rooms exist, but the sense of ownership is fragile. Even the servants, those closest to the daily reality of power, can feel the change in atmosphere when the court doesn't fully trust itself. Official acts continue because governance cannot pause. But the home feels provisional. The royal seal may still be pressed, but the hands around it might already be planning the next transition. Harold's domestic world underscores a truth that repeats throughout monarchy. The most unsettling palaces are not the cold ones. They're the ones where everyone is warm, but nobody feels secure. And then comes Harthacnut, whose reign adds another layer of tension to these same spaces, like a different storm passing through the same streets. Harthacnut and the cost of being obeyed. Harthacnut's reign, also brief in the early 1040s, is remembered for severity and the hard demand of obedience. In such a climate, the royal home becomes a place where fear and formality intertwine. The hall isn't just for feasting, it's for demonstrations of authority. The king's residences remain the kingdom's residences. London, Winchester, the known centers of administration. But the way they are used can change dramatically depending on the ruler's temperament. A palace can be a home, or it can be a courtroom, or it can be a warning. Imagine the domestic details. Guards standing a little straighter, voices dropping when the king's footsteps approach. Officials careful with phrasing, nobles cautious about jokes that might be misunderstood. The household becomes disciplined, and discipline can feel like order or oppression, depending on which side of the table you're on. Records and later narratives describe harshness, though the precise balance of legend and fact can blur. Still, the broader picture is believable. A contested reign often tries to compensate with force, and force needs a stage. The irony is that this kind of rule can hollow out the very spaces it occupies. A palace that becomes a place of dread stops feeling like a home at all. It becomes a machine for compliance. And speaking of machines, next we reach a monarch whose home will help build one of the most famous political religious machines in English history, Westminster. Edward the Confessor and the birth of Westminster as a royal center. Edward the Confessor's reign, beginning in 1042, is a turning point in the geography of royal home. Yes, kings have used London and Winchester before, but Edward's association with Westminster gives the place a different kind of permanence. Religious, political, architectural, Westminster becomes more than a convenient location. It becomes a statement. Building and endowing the abbey is not merely piety. It's an attempt to anchor kingship in sacred stone, to fuse rule with holiness in a way people can see and touch. Imagine the atmosphere of Edward's court, the slow grandeur of church building, the smell of incense mingling with the everyday smells of cooking and damp wool, the sound of chanting threading through the more practical noises of governance. The royal residence near Westminster ties the king's domestic life to a religious project that will outlast him. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe Edward's devotion, though the details can be shaped by hagiography. Still, Westminster's rise is undeniable. The home of the monarch begins to gravitate toward a place that will become the heart of English political identity. And this matters because it changes what home means. A king's home can now be an institution with a shadow that stretches centuries. You're not just living somewhere, you're making a center. And then, like a door kicked open, comes 1066, when new rulers step into these spaces and begin remaking them with a different kind of stone. Harold Godwinson and the last home of Anglo-Saxon kings. Harold Godwinson's brief reign in 1066 is a moment of compressed urgency. His home is less a settled domestic world and more a command post in a kingdom about to be tested from multiple directions. Harold is deeply tied to the great aristocratic households of England. His power emerges from networks of land, loyalty, and local authority. So his sense of home includes places associated with his family, manors, halls, estates, alongside the royal centers he inherits as king. But the reign is too short for architectural ambition. The rooms he occupies are already full of history. Westminster's developing significance, The older pull of Winchester, the practical need to assemble forces quickly. Domestic. Life is dominated by movement, messages, preparations. Imagine the texture. Hurried meals, armor stacked near walls, advisors speaking in tight clusters. The king's chamber used for councils that run late into the night. The home is where decisions are made at speed, where fatigue gathers in the corners. Harold's story is also a reminder of how quickly a royal home can become a relic. One battle can end not only a reign, but a whole domestic culture of kingship. The familiar pattern of halls, customs, and court life is about to be overwritten. And speaking of overwriting, next comes William, who doesn't just move into English royal spaces, he redesigns the idea of security itself, in stone. William I and the Fortress Home. When William becomes king after 1066, he inherits English centers of power, but he does not trust them. That lack of trust shapes his homes. Under William, the royal residence becomes inseparable from the fortress. Home is where you can hold the ground. Even if the surrounding population hates you, London's importance sharpens, and the Tower of London begins its long life as both symbol and weapon, a place that says in stone that the new king intends to stay. Winchester retains ceremonial and administrative value, but the Norman approach changes the skyline of authority across the kingdom. Imagine William's domestic world as heavy with stone and hierarchy. Norman castles rise where timber halls once dominated, and the experience of entering a royal home changes. Gates, walls, guard rooms, a feeling of being watched. The king's safety becomes architecture. Records like the Great Survey completed in 1086, often known as Domesday, reflect a ruler obsessed with control and knowledge. And where do you think that knowledge is processed? Indoors, in rooms where scribes gather information, where officials compare entries, where the king's household turns land into data and data into power. William's home is not cozy. It is functional, intimidating, and deliberately alien. The message is clear. The ruler lives behind walls, and those walls are part of the ruling. And as we move forward, you'll see the royal home slowly soften again, though it never entirely forgets what conquest taught it. William II and the royal home as a hunting base. William II, Rufus, inherits his father's kingdom in 1087 and leans hard into a different kind of royal home. He still relies on fortresses, still understands the value of stone walls and controlled gates, but his domestic identity is shaped by movement and sport. The king's home becomes, quite often, wherever the hunting is. This matters because hunting isn't a hobby here. It's politics in boots. It's a way to gather nobles without calling a formal council, to reward favorites with proximity, to keep warriors occupied, to demonstrate vitality, and to claim ownership of the landscape itself. Royal forests, created and enforced with brutal legal force, become part of the monarch's residential world. The king's home spreads outward into a controlled environment of deer, wardens, and punishments. Winchester remains central, and Westminster is rising in importance. But William II's court also radiates through places used seasonally, particularly in and around the New Forest. The domestic scenes are vivid: lodgings that swell with visitors, kitchens that race to feed sudden arrivals, stables overflowing, servants scrambling to keep pace with the king's impatient appetite for speed and display. Contemporary chroniclers often portray Rufus as hard and flamboyant, sometimes with obvious moral judgment, but the physical pattern is clear. Royal residence becomes a circuit of places designed to keep the king entertained and visible. Home is not a single hearth. It's the king's orbit, wherever his presence makes the land feel like his property. And speaking of property, no monarch will take home more, personally or more obsessively, than the next one. Henry I and the administrative household. Henry I takes the throne in 1100, and with him, the royal home grows sharper edges of paperwork. This is the reign where the household becomes a true administrative engine, more consistent, more documented, more capable of governing, even when the king is elsewhere. The king's residences still include the great centers: Winchester for treasury traditions, Westminster for ceremonial gravity, London for access and commerce. But now they feel connected by a web of officials who know exactly what they're doing. Henry's home is also shaped by his building and consolidation. Royal castles and residences across England and Normandy are used strategically, not just to frighten rebels, but to place the king where he needs to be. A royal household in this era is huge. Clerks, cooks, grooms, guards, chaplains, craftsmen, messengers, moving like a traveling town. Yet the rooms inside these places begin to matter in more specific ways. There are spaces for record keeping, for storing money, for sealing documents. The king's chamber becomes an office as much as a private refuge. The domestic becomes governmental, and that transformation is one of the quiet revolutions of medieval rule. Imagine the feel of it: wax, parchment, ink, the scratch of quills, the careful counting of coin. Outside, the familiar medieval noises: horses, carts, shouting servants. Inside, the concentrated hush of administration. Henry's reign also reminds us that home can be legal. The king's court, the place where justice is done, travels with him. If you want your dispute settled, you go where the king is. In that sense, the monarch's residence is literally where the law sleeps at night. And speaking of restless sleep, Henry's succession crisis will turn royal homes into contested prizes, as if the buildings themselves can choose a side. Stephen and the Civil War castle courts. Stephen's reign, beginning in 1135, drags England into a period later remembered as chaos, the kind of chaos where home becomes whatever you can hold. In Civil War, a palace is not merely a residence, it is a supply depot, a prison, a bargaining chip, a refuge, and a symbol you can wave at your enemies. Royal homes in Stephen's time fragment. Westminster and London matter, but authority is constantly challenged. The royal household strains, because its stability depends on stable revenue, and revenue depends on control. Castles multiply, and the home of power becomes a network of fortifications, some loyal to the king, some to his rivals, some to local lords acting like kings in miniature. Imagine domestic life under these conditions. The same stone halls, the same great chambers, but now stocked for siege. Food stores guarded, doors barred, the mood tight. Servants whispering about which lord will arrive next, and whether arrival means celebration or looting. The court's movement takes on a frantic quality. When the monarch cannot fully trust the road, the concept of home becomes a set of safe points, and safety is negotiated through hostages, marriages, payments, promises that may dissolve as soon as the messenger leaves the courtyard. This is also a period when royal women's residences, places associated with queens and empresses, become politically charged, because legitimacy itself is contested. A hall can host not only feasts, but rival claimants. Stephen's reign makes one thing painfully clear: the royal home is only as stable as the political world outside its walls. If the kingdom fractures, the domestic world fractures with it. And speaking of repair, next comes a monarch who will try to mend the realm so thoroughly that the royal home begins to feel like an institution again. Henry II and the Angevin Empire's moving palace. Henry II, crowned in 1154, rules not just England but a sprawling patchwork of territories, an empire of sorts, stretching across large parts of France. For him, the royal home cannot be fixed. It must be mobile. It must be a system. Henry's residences include Westminster and the older English centers, but they also include an immense circuit of castles, palaces, and hunting lodges across England and France. The king is famous for movement, restless, constantly traveling, constantly asserting control. In that sense, his home is his saddle and the household that follows. But Henry also invests in places that become particularly associated with him. Chinon and Anjou, for example, and other strongholds on the continent function as key bases. In England, royal residences are used strategically to keep nobles close, to project authority, to administer justice. Domestic life under Henry is intense. His household includes administrators who are transforming governance, people who can process complaints, manage revenues, issue orders. The home becomes bureaucratic. Rooms fill with documents. The hall still matters for ceremony, but the chambers matter for policy. Imagine arriving at a royal residence when Henry is there. The place would be buzzing. Clerks copying orders, petitioners waiting, knights training, servants hauling supplies, messengers arriving covered in road dust. A medieval palace as a kind of living organism. Henry's family life also stamps itself onto the geography. His conflict with Eleanor of Aquitaine and their sons turns certain residences into sites of tension and imprisonment. A palace can be a cage when politics becomes personal. And speaking of personal, Henry's death will have the strange intimacy of a man returning at the end to a place that feels like a last room in a long corridor. Richard Eredites and the home. He hardly used. Richard I becomes king in 1189, but his home in England is almost a rumor compared to his crusading and continental wars. His domestic life is less about living in English palaces and more about funding campaigns, negotiating alliances, and surviving captivity. Still, England's royal residences matter during his reign because they function as administrative and symbolic centers, even when the king is absent. Westminster remains the stage for major political ceremonies. The Tower of London, already significant, continues as a crucial stronghold. Royal castles across the realm hold authority on the king's behalf. When Richard is in England, which is rare, the court becomes a compressed burst of activity. Decisions made quickly, taxes demanded, plans launched. The king's home becomes a temporary blaze rather than a steady lamp. Imagine the strange feeling of a palace awaiting a monarch who seldom arrives. Servants maintaining rooms that may go unused. Officials preparing for sudden summons. The kingdom's domestic architecture of power holding its breath. Richard's absence also highlights something important. The royal home is not only for the king, it's for the monarchy. The institution can occupy buildings and demand resources even without the monarch's body there. In that sense, palaces begin to feel like permanent organs of state. And then comes John, a king whose relationship to home will be defined by loss, suspicion, and the desperate need to keep what he can. John and the castles of fear and loss. King John takes the throne in 1199 and spends much of his reign watching his territories unravel. In domestic terms, this produces a particular atmosphere, a king in castles that feel less like comfortable residences and more like places to clutch power. John uses royal castles aggressively, moving between them, garrisoning them, demanding loyalty, punishing defiance. The home becomes defensive. It's about holding keys, controlling doors, keeping treasure secure. The Tower of London remains vital, and other strongholds across England become the stepping stones of royal control. John's reign also produces more documentation, more administrative scrutiny, more checking. Household records and government roles reflect a court that is both active and anxious. A king who distrusts his barons builds systems to monitor them. Imagine John in a stone chamber with messengers coming in at all hours. The air cold even near the hearth, maps spread out, advisors arguing. The domestic details, who eats with the king, who sleeps near him, who is allowed to speak privately, become charged with paranoia. The conflict that leads to Magna Carta in 1215 is not just political, it's spatial. Barons demand limits on the king's ability to exploit their lands and bodies, and the royal household's reach is part of what they resist. The king's home, as an institution, has been too hungry. John's domestic world shows that palaces are not neutral. They are mouths. They consume resources, attention, obedience. When that consumption feels unbearable, people push back. And speaking of pushing back, Henry III will respond by building, beautifying, and sacralizing the royal home until it starts to look like a different kind of argument. Henry III and the reinvention of Westminster Palace. Henry III becomes king as a child in 1216, and over his long reign the royal home in England becomes more visibly artistic, deliberate, and, crucially, tied to Westminster. Henry is a builder. He is also a king who believes in sacred monarchy, and his domestic choices reflect that belief. Westminster Palace becomes a central royal residence and governmental hub, while Westminster Abbey, rebuilt magnificently under Henry's patronage, acts as the spiritual twin of royal power. The king's home is now adjacent to a monumental religious statement. This is not accidental. It is a strategy of legitimacy. One of the most famous spaces connected to Henry's reign is the Great Hall of Westminster Palace, though it will later be rebuilt under Richard II. Even before that later, rebuilding Westminster's halls, chambers, and chapels are key settings for royal life. Henry invests in rooms that are not only functional but symbolic. Decorations, stained glass, painted walls. Imagine the domestic experience. A palace that is still medieval, busy, smoky, crowded, but increasingly adorned. Tapestries, color, religious imagery, the king's private devotion spilling into public architecture. Henry's home also includes other royal residences. Windsor, for example, which grows in importance as both fortress and favored retreat. Windsor's position and defensibility make it attractive, and its gradual transformation will continue across centuries. Henry's reign shows a monarchy trying to persuade through beauty as well as command. A home can be propaganda, but propaganda can be gentle. It can be a glowing window instead of a raised sword. And speaking of swords, I'll bring the edge back, turning royal homes into instruments of conquest and administration across a wider archipelago. Edward the Rere and the castle as an imperial home. Edward the Rere takes the throne in 1272 and earns a reputation as a hammer of authority. Under him, the royal home becomes deeply intertwined with conquest, especially in Wales, and with the expansion of English administrative reach. Edward uses Westminster as a governmental center and keeps Windsor as a major residence, but his architectural legacy is also written in the great castles of Wales, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris. These are not merely military structures. They are statements of domination built to house garrisons, intimidate populations, and provide royal bases in contested lands. Imagine what it means for a conqueror to build a home in newly subdued territory. The castle is designed so that the king can arrive, hold court, sleep safely, and project magnificence. It's a portable piece of the monarchy embedded in stone. Edward's domestic world also includes movement and administration. His reign sees the growth of Parliament as a more regular feature, which ties the royal home, especially Westminster, more tightly to governance. Rooms in the palace become spaces where representatives gather, where grievances are aired, where taxes are negotiated. So the royal home now has two faces, the domestic and the political. The same building that hosts the king's meals also hosts the kingdom's arguments. Edward's reign reveals a pattern that will repeat. When the monarchy expands its reach, it expands its architecture. Walls and halls multiply. And speaking of halls, next comes Edward II, whose domestic life becomes infamous, not because of buildings alone, but because of who is allowed inside them. Edward the Sceau and the politics of favorites in private chambers. Edward II becomes king in 1307, and his reign is shaped by conflict over intimacy, over favorites, access, and who gets the king's attention behind closed doors. The royal home becomes, once again, a battlefield of proximity. Residences like Westminster and Windsor remain central. The king also uses other castles and palaces, as medieval monarchs do, moving for governance, hunting, and security. But what makes Edward's domestic geography distinctive is the way private spaces become politically explosive. The king's chamber, his inner household, becomes a focal point. Nobles resent the influence of favorites, and that resentment is not abstract. It is spatial. Who stands near the king's bedchamber door? Who eats at his private table? Who controls access to him when petitions arrive? Contemporary accounts are often hostile, and later narratives can exaggerate. Still, the political pattern is well documented. Baronial opposition to the king's inner circle, leading to crises that shape the reign. Imagine a royal residence where the public hall is only half the story. The real decisions might be made in smaller rooms and whispered conversations in the king's retreat spaces. The architecture of palaces, layers of doors, chambers within chambers, enables favoritism to become governance. Edward II's domestic world also ends in displacement and humiliation, reminding us that home can be stripped away. A king can lose not only castles but the right to inhabit them as king. And speaking of inheritance, Edward III will rebuild not just authority but the glamour of monarchy, filling royal residences with a new kind of theatrical chivalry. Edward III and the chivalric court at Windsor. Edward III takes the throne in 1327 and reinvents the atmosphere of royal home. Under him, Windsor Castle becomes a centerpiece of monarchy, not just a fortress, not just a residence, but a stage for chivalric identity. This is the period of the Order of the Garter, of tournaments, of a court culture that wants to look magnificent and inevitable. Westminster remains the governmental hub, but Windsor gains a special emotional and symbolic charge. Edward invests in building works there, turning it into a grand setting for royal display. The castle's spaces are used to host ceremonies that bind nobles to the crown through honor, spectacle, and shared identity. Imagine a domestic scene at Windsor under Edward III. Banners, polished armor, the sound of music, the controlled chaos of a large household preparing for a feast. The great hall filled with light and noise. The chapel used for vows and prayers that carry political weight. Edward's reign is also one of long war, the 100 Years' War, so the royal home functions as a command center too. Plans are made within palace walls. Resources are gathered. Victories are celebrated. Captives are held. The chivalric glamour can obscure the costs, taxes, campaigns, deaths, but domestically, it creates a sense of purpose. The king's home becomes the hearth of a national myth, England as a warrior kingdom with a noble court. And speaking of myth, Richard II will take the idea of royal splendor and push it towards something almost theatrical, reshaping Westminster's very heart. Richard II and the new Westminster Hall. Richard II becomes king in 1377, and his reign leaves one of the most enduring physical spaces of English political life, the rebuilt Westminster Hall. The hall we think of, vast hammer-beam roof, grand scale, is closely tied to Richard's vision of monarchy. Westminster Palace is not simply where the king lives, it's where the king is seen as the embodiment of the realm. Richard's investments in the palace and its ceremonial spaces are attempts to make authority visible, architectural, unavoidable. Imagine entering Westminster Hall after its transformation. The scale overwhelms you. The roof seems to float, an engineered miracle. The space can hold enormous gatherings, feasts, courts, parliaments. It is designed to make the monarchy feel like the natural center of gravity. Richard's domestic style is associated with elaborate ceremony, and in such a court, rooms become scripts. The way you approach the king, the distance you keep, the words you use, the clothes you wear, everything becomes part of the performance. But performances can become brittle. Richard's reign ends in deposition, and the irony is sharp. The grand spaces built to magnify monarchy become stages for its humiliation. A hall meant to glorify a king can also witness his fall. Still, the architecture remains. The royal home outlasts the ruler. And speaking of outlasting, next comes the House of Lancaster. where royal residences must project legitimacy strong enough to survive the memory of usurpation. Henry IV and the home of a usurper. Henry IV takes the throne in 1399 after deposing Richard II, and his domestic world is haunted by that act. A king who comes to power through force must make home feel legitimate, safe, orderly, divinely approved. Westminster remains central because you cannot abandon the kingdom's ceremonial heart. The palace, the abbey, the familiar spaces of governance, these are crucial for presenting continuity. But Henry also relies on other residences for security, including Windsor, which offers defensibility and distance from London's volatility. Imagine the atmosphere in Henry's court: vigilance. A new dynasty needs to watch for plots, rebellions, discontent. The royal household becomes a fortress of protocol, with access controlled carefully. Henry's health problems later in life also shape domestic space. A sick king changes the rhythm of residence. The bedchamber becomes political again. Advisors gather close. Decisions are filtered through illness. In this reign, home is about managing danger, both physical and symbolic. The crown must be made to look stable in rooms where people still remember the previous king walking. Henry III's domestic world is not flamboyant. It's cautious, heavy with responsibility, and constantly aware that walls alone cannot protect a dynasty from doubt. And speaking of dynasties, Henry V will turn the royal home into a launching point for war, then leave behind a child king whose palaces must carry a burden far too large for small shoulders. Henry III in the court between campaigns. Henry III becomes king in 1413, and his reign is often told through battlefields, especially Agincourt in 1415. But even warrior kings have homes, and the way Henry uses royal residences reflects his purpose: preparation, mobilization, and projection. Westminster is essential for governance and for the rituals that support war: parliaments to grant taxes, ceremonies to frame campaigns as righteous. Royal castles and palaces become logistical hubs, places where supplies are gathered, where commanders meet, where the household transforms into a war machine. Imagine the domestic energy: armorers working, clerks drafting orders, kitchens feeding large numbers of men, stables crowded with horses. The palace becomes a place of controlled urgency. Henry's personal piety also shapes his domestic atmosphere. Chapels matter. Religious observance is woven into the household routine, reinforcing the king's image as disciplined and divinely favored. But Henry's reign is short. His death in 1422 leaves the monarchy in the hands of an infant, and that changes everything. A child king doesn't inhabit home the way an adult does. The palace becomes a nursery and a political arena at once. And speaking of nurseries, Henry VI's long reign will turn royal residences into spaces of guardianship, faction, and eventually civil war. Henry VI and the palaces of a king who could not hold them. Henry VI becomes king as a baby in 1422 and grows into a ruler known for piety and fragility. Under him, the royal home is shaped by guardianship, by regents, councils, and powerful men who manage access to the king like a resource. Westminster remains the ceremonial and administrative center, but the court's stability is repeatedly shaken. Henry's episodes of mental collapse make the domestic geography even more charged. When the king cannot function, the rooms around him become contested. Imagine a palace where the king's presence is both sacred and vulnerable. Servants move quietly. Advisors argue in side chambers. Courtiers watch each other for signs of advantage. The bedchamber door becomes a political boundary. As the Wars of the Roses begin, royal residences become targets. Castles and palaces are seized, occupied, lost, retaken. The monarchy's home becomes unstable in a literal sense, its buildings changing hands as quickly as its crowns. Henry's domestic world ends with imprisonment and death, and the tragedy feels architectural. A king whose reign was meant to be sanctified ends enclosed, controlled, displaced. And speaking of displacement, Edward the Fox will restore a kind of confidence and with it a renewed emphasis on luxury and the pleasures of residence. Edward, if in the comfort of a restored court. Edward IV becomes king in 1461, and one of the striking shifts under his rule is the return of a more confident, materially comfortable court, at least when compared to the austerity and fragility of Henry VI's kingship. The royal home begins to feel less like a sick room guarded by factions and more like a residence designed for display, hospitality, and enjoyment. Westminster remains the center of government, but Edward is also closely associated with palaces and castles that offer both security and comfort. Windsor continues as a major royal home, and the court's domestic life leans into feasting, ceremony, and the kind of splendor that asserts legitimacy by sheer sensory force. Imagine the internal world of an Edwardian palace: bright cloth, rich colors, plenty of food, music, laughter that sounds real rather than forced. This is not merely indulgence, it's political messaging. After civil conflict, the crown wants to look stable. A thriving household implies a thriving realm. Edward's reign also strengthens the sense that the monarchy's residences are permanent centers of culture. The royal wardrobe, meaning the department that manages clothing and textiles, becomes a visible sign of wealth. The home is filled with objects that speak: tapestries, plate, furnishings, imported luxuries. Yet the Wars of the Roses aren't truly over. Underneath comfort, there is always calculation. Domestic space, especially private chambers, remains political. Who is close to the king? Who is admitted at night? Who is trusted with keys and seals? Edward IV's court shows us a monarchy trying to soothe a bruised kingdom with the soft power of domestic grandeur. And speaking of bruises, Edward's early death leads to one of the most chilling transformations of royal home. From palace to trap, Edward V and the Tower as a home that wasn't. Edward V becomes king in 1483 as a boy, and his home story is inseparable from the Tower of London, nominally a royal residence and fortress, but also a place with a long history as a prison. In a succession crisis, architecture becomes fate. The Tower had long served multiple roles: stronghold, treasury, ceremonial lodging for monarchs before coronations. But for Edward V, it becomes a place of confinement. The domestic language of staying there, of being housed for safety, collides with political reality. The details of what happened are infamous and contested in certain specifics, shaped by later propaganda and uncertainty. But the core tragedy is solid. A child king was removed from power and disappeared within a royal building that should have been a symbol of continuity. Imagine the emotional atmosphere, the stone corridors, the controlled access, the way familiar household comforts might be offered while the larger situation tightens like a noose. The Tower is physically within the royal world, yet it is also separate, its walls making home feel like isolation. This moment shows how royal residences can be double-edged. A place built for security can become the perfect place to neutralize a rival. A palace can become a mechanism. And speaking of mechanisms, Richard III takes power and uses royal spaces to project legitimacy, even as suspicion clings to the very stones beneath him. Richard III and the need to look settled. Richard III's reign begins in 1483 and lasts only 2 years, but it is filled with an urgent need to appear rightful. In such a reign, the royal home becomes a stage for legitimacy. Westminster and the established ceremonial spaces matter immensely because you cannot invent monarchy from scratch. You must inhabit its recognized rooms. Richard also has strong ties to northern England, and his domestic identity includes residences and networks there. This regional base shapes how he moves and where his support feels strongest. The royal household is used to gather loyalty, reward followers, and perform stability. Imagine a court where every gesture is slightly over-meaningful, every feast a reassurance, every public appearance a claim, every stay in a well-known palace a reminder that the king occupies the traditional center. But the shadow of controversy over the fate of Edward V and his brother hangs over domestic life. The private spaces of the palace are whispered about because people imagine secrets happening behind doors. Richard's end at Bosworth in 1485 shifts not just the crown but the entire domestic future of monarchy. The Tudor dynasty that follows will reshape royal homes dramatically, turning medieval palaces into Renaissance statements. And speaking of statements, Henry VII will make home into a controlled, disciplined institution designed to prevent the chaos that preceded him. Henry VII and the careful household of a new dynasty. Henry VII takes the throne in 1485, founding the Tudor dynasty, and his relationship to royal residence is cautious and deliberate. He has won the crown by battle and tenuous claim, so he builds legitimacy through control over finances, over nobility, over the court itself. Westminster remains central, of course, but Henry VII also invests in specific residences that reflect a new kind of domestic priority. One of the most important is Richmond Palace, rebuilt from the older Sheen Palace after a fire and renamed in a gesture of dynastic identity. Richmond becomes a favored royal home, combining comfort with prestige. Greenwich Palace also rises in significance, associated with Tudor splendor, and positioned to connect the monarchy to London and the river. A practical artery of travel, the Thames becomes a kind of royal corridor, linking residences like beads on a string. Imagine Henry VII's domestic world as disciplined. The household is regulated, expenses are monitored, access to the king is managed. The palace is less riotous than some earlier courts. It is the feeling of a man who has survived danger and intends not to be surprised again. This is also a period where the monarchy's residences begin to look more modern in taste, still medieval in structure, but increasingly shaped by Renaissance influences and by the desire for comfort and private space. Henry VII's home is about stability manufactured daily through routine. And speaking of routine, Henry VIII will explode it, filling royal residences with spectacle, appetite, and relentless reinvention. Henry VIII and the palace as a world. Henry VIII becomes king in 1509, and under him the royal home becomes an entire universe, expanding in size, in luxury, and in symbolic ambition. He doesn't just live in palaces, he uses them to declare himself the axis of the realm. The key residences of Henry's reign form a constellation around London, connected by the Thames and by roads that can carry a massive household. Greenwich Palace is central early on, tied to his birth and his image as a youthful prince king. Richmond remains important. Hampton Court becomes iconic, first associated with Cardinal Wolsey, then seized and transformed into one of Henry's greatest stages. Whitehall Palace rises into prominence as well, growing from York Place into a sprawling complex that becomes a principal royal residence. Westminster remains vital for governance and ceremony, but Henry's domestic life is not confined. It spills. Imagine Hampton Court in Henry's prime. The courtyards crowded, the kitchens producing astonishing volumes of food, the scent of roasting meat, the clink of plate, the thick presence of guards and courtiers. The palace is a machine designed to impress. Even walking through it is an argument. Look how much I can consume, build, command. Henry's home is also religious politics made stone. As he breaks with Rome and reshapes the English church, the domestic spaces of monarchy absorb that shift. Chapels, religious imagery, rituals, all are reinterpreted under royal supremacy. And then there is the private world, the king's chambers, the queen's lodgings, the shifting domestic geography of wives. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, each has her own relationship to palaces, to rooms that can become sanctuaries or traps, depending on the king's favor. In Henry's reign, the royal home is alive with appetite and danger. It is sumptuous, but it is never entirely safe. A corridor can lead to a feast or to a summons that ruins you, And speaking of ruin, after Henry, the monarchy will oscillate between splendor and anxiety as the next rulers inherit palaces stuffed with history and religious conflict. Edward VI and the Protestant court in old rooms. Edward VI becomes king in 1547 as a child, and his domestic world is shaped by regency and reform. The palaces he inherits, Hampton Court, Whitehall, Greenwich, Richmond, are enormous. Structures created for his father's appetite for grandeur. But Edward's reign moves through them with a different purpose: Protestant transformation and political control by advisors. The home becomes a place where religious change is enacted. Chapels are altered in use and symbolism. Ceremonies shift. The atmosphere of devotion becomes different, less ornate, more doctrinal, more aggressively reformist in many settings. Imagine a vast palace built for Henry VIII's theatrical kingship now hosting a boy king whose authority is mediated through councils and protectors. The halls are still grand, the kitchen still large, the servants still busy, but the center of gravity feels altered. Decisions are made around Edward, often on his behalf. Domestic space becomes political because regents need proximity. Whoever controls access to Edward controls governance. The king's chamber is an arena. The nursery becomes a nerve center. Edward's ill health late in his reign tightens everything. Rooms grow quieter. Movement becomes more controlled. The sense of time running out fills the palace like cold air. And then abruptly comes a succession crisis where home becomes a place you must seize quickly, because whoever occupies the palace can occupy the crown. Lady Jane Grey and the brief borrowed palace. Lady Jane Grey's claim in 1553 is brief, so brief that her home as queen feels like a borrowed costume. The political machinery tries to place her within the royal spaces, to make her seem inevitable by surrounding her with the architecture of monarchy. The settings matter. The Tower of London, traditionally used as a royal residence before coronations, becomes part of this grim drama. It is meant to be a staging place for the transition. Instead, it becomes a prelude to downfall. The domestic experience of such a moment would be surreal. Rooms filled with people acting as if the future is settled while anxiety vibrates underneath. Servants, continuing routines. Courtiers, choosing sides. Officials, watching for signals from the wider city. Jane's story is saturated with tragedy, but from the angle of home, it reveals the harsh truth that palaces do not protect you from politics. They amplify it. The stone walls and ceremonial rooms are indifferent. They can host one monarch today and another tomorrow. And speaking of tomorrow, Mary, I will occupy these same spaces with a fierce sense of mission, reshaping domestic life according to her Catholic restoration and her own deeply personal struggles. Mary I in the palaces of restoration and loneliness. Mary I becomes queen in 1553, and her domestic world is filled with the weight of restoration, religious, dynastic, personal. The palaces she inhabits carry her father's legacy and her brother's reforms. She must make them feel like hers. Whitehall and Hampton Court remain central royal residences. Richmond and Greenwich still matter, though Greenwich will later decline. The Tower of London remains symbolically important. Westminster provides the ceremonial and political setting. Mary's reign is marked by her Catholic program, and that shapes palace life. Chapels, rituals, and the visual culture of devotion become more prominent again. Domestic space reflects religious identity. What services are held, what images are displayed, what music fills the chapel. But Mary's personal life also gives her residences a different emotional texture. Her marriage to Philip of Spain, her hopes for an heir, her false pregnancies, and the growing realization of her isolation, these are domestic realities. Royal homes are filled with people, yet a monarch can still be lonely within them. Imagine Mary walking through long corridors where portraits and tapestries proclaim Tudor authority, yet her private rooms carry the hush of disappointment. The public spaces of the palace can be crowded, ceremonial, loud. The private chamber can be painfully quiet. Mary's home is both a throne room and a waiting room, waiting for legitimacy to feel secure, for an heir that never comes, for divine approval that she believes depends on religious correctness. And speaking of waiting, Elizabeth will turn the royal home into something else entirely, a moving theater of presence, designed to be seen and remembered. Elizabeth I and the endless progress of royal home. Elizabeth I becomes queen in 1558, and her home is as much strategy as shelter. She inherits the great Tudor palaces, Whitehall, Hampton Court, Richmond, Greenwich, and more, but she also perfects something uniquely effective, the royal progress. The monarchy becomes mobile theater. A progress is not simply a vacation, it's a way to be seen, to remind nobles and towns that the queen is real, present, watching. It's also a way to shift the cost of hosting the court onto wealthy subjects. When the royal household arrives, it eats, it consumes, it turns an estate into a temporary capital, and the host pays for the privilege of proximity. So Elizabeth's home becomes plural. Whitehall is her main base in London, sprawling and crowded with courtiers. Hampton Court remains crucial, offering both grandeur and a touch of distance from the city. Richmond serves as a familiar Tudor anchor. Greenwich continues early in her reign, but begins to fade later. Windsor remains important as a fortified retreat and ceremonial site. But the real texture of Elizabeth's domestic life is movement through other people's homes. Kenilworth, for example, and countless great houses that shape the memory of her reign. The Queen's presence transforms rooms into political stages. A private gallery becomes a place for secret negotiations. A garden becomes a place where courtiers watch her reactions like astronomers watching the sky. Imagine the sensory life of an Elizabethan progress. Banners, music, fresh rushes laid down, hosts frantically improving rooms, kitchens stretched to their limits, the smell of sweat and perfume and smoke, the queen carried in a litter or riding, the court glittering behind her, the road itself becoming part of royal residence. Elizabeth's palaces are also haunted by security concerns. Threats, real and perceived, shape access to her chambers. The Queen's private space is guarded not only physically but socially. Who gets close is a matter of state. In Elizabeth's reign, home becomes performance. The Queen as the constant center wherever she is. And speaking of centers, James VI of Scotland will become James I of England, and with him, the royal household expands into a three-kingdom complexity, while the physical center of court life begins to shift in tone. James I and the Stuart court in Whitehall's shadow. James becomes King of England in 1603, uniting crowns and bringing a Scottish court culture into English palaces. The principal royal residence in London remains Whitehall Palace, vast, chaotic, the beating heart of Stuart court life. Hampton Court remains important, as does Windsor, and other residences continue to be used. James's domestic world is shaped by new emphases, elaborate masks, court entertainments, and a style of kingship that leans into intellectual display and theological argument. Palaces become spaces not only for governance, but for spectacle, though the Stuart spectacle has a different flavor from the Tudors. Whitehall, in particular, becomes the central home of monarchy. It is enormous, a complex of buildings, rather than a single structure, packed with courtiers and offices. The banqueting house, rebuilt under James and later magnificently redesigned under Charles I, becomes a jewel within that sprawling mess, representing the court's desire to have at least one space that looks controlled and perfect. Imagine James at Whitehall, corridors crowded, petitions flowing, courtiers clustering, performances staged in candlelit rooms, the smell of wax and sweat and expensive cloth. The palace is alive, but it is also unwieldy. James's reign also brings the English court into closer contact with global trade and colonial expansion. Objects from far away, Commodities, curiosities, luxuries enter domestic spaces. The royal home becomes a place where the world is displayed, often without much thought to the violence that made those objects travel. Yet for all the bustle, James's court also has the mood of negotiation. Parliament is more assertive. Religious tensions simmer. The royal home at Westminster and Whitehall becomes a place where these tensions are managed, sometimes clumsily. And speaking of clumsiness, Charles the Frederick will attempt to make monarchy more refined, more sacred, more artistically perfect. The problem is that politics is not an artwork that holds still. Charles arrives in the beautiful, brittle palace. Charles becomes king in 1625 and brings an intense aesthetic vision to royal home. Under him, the court invests deeply in art, ceremony, and the idea of monarchy as a sacred institution. Whitehall remains central, and the banqueting house, completed under James but transformed in meaning under Charles, becomes iconic, especially with the great ceiling paintings by Rubens that celebrate kingship in visual thunder. Charles also values other residences, Hampton Court, Windsor, and a range of palaces used for retreat and display. He and Henrietta Maria cultivate a court culture that can feel exclusive, refined, and deeply ceremonial. Imagine the domestic atmosphere: paintings, music, carefully staged appearances, a sense of hierarchy sharpened by etiquette. The king's private rooms become more private in spirit, guarded by protocol. Access becomes a sign of favor. But this refinement has a cost. The court's perceived distance from the wider kingdom fuels resentment. The beautiful palace becomes to many a symbol of aloofness. The more Charles insists on sacred authority, the more he collides with political forces that want limits. As conflict grows, the royal home becomes militarized. Whitehall remains the great symbol, but security becomes urgent. Windsor becomes a crucial stronghold. Oxford, during the Civil War, becomes the king's base for a time, turning a university town into a royal court with wartime improvisation. Imagine domestic life in a court at war. Fine rituals strained by scarcity. Loyalists trying to keep ceremony alive while cannons echo. Palaces that were designed for splendor, now hosting councils about survival. Charles Avert's story ends with one of the most haunting uses of a royal residence in British history: his execution outside the banqueting house at Whitehall in 1649. The palace becomes the backdrop for the end of monarchy, temporarily. And speaking of temporarily, England's royal homes will soon be occupied by a different kind of ruler, one who does not wear a crown but understands exactly how buildings can project authority. Oliver Cromwell and the uncomfortable use of royal spaces. During the Commonwealth and Protectorate, royal residences do not disappear. They are repurposed. Power still needs rooms, places to meet, to store documents, to display authority, to house the household of governance. Oliver Cromwell, as Lord Protector, uses former royal palaces, Hampton Court among them, because the infrastructure is too valuable to ignore. Yet the symbolism is awkward. A regime built on the rejection of monarchy now inhabits spaces soaked in monarchical meaning. Imagine the domestic tension: the same grand halls, the same long galleries, now hosting a different political culture. Some ceremonial elements are stripped away, but the architecture itself keeps speaking. A palace is stubborn, it remembers. Hampton Court under Cromwell is especially evocative. It is a place that still feels Tudor in its bones, and yet it houses a Puritan-influenced regime trying to look godly rather than glamorous. The contrast is almost audible. The silence after the music stops, the plainness imposed on spaces designed for show. This period reminds us that home is not just about comfort, it's about legitimacy. Cromwell needs a domestic base that can support government. The palaces provide that, but their very grandeur raises questions about whether power can ever fully escape the temptation of the throne's furniture. And then, in 1660, the monarchy returns. The doors swing open again for kings, And speaking of swinging doors, Charles II will make the restored court feel alive, sensual, and socially hungry, while the palaces themselves begin to change with new tastes and new needs. Charles II and the restoration of court life. Charles II returns in 1660, and the royal home becomes, almost instantly, a symbol of revival. Whitehall Palace resumes its place as the principal London residence. Hampton Court, Windsor, and other royal properties come back into the orbit of court life. The mood shifts from Puritan restraint to a court culture famous for pleasure, wit, and the lively politics of proximity. Imagine Whitehall in the Restoration. Crowded corridors, laughter, perfume, the constant murmur of gossip. The palace is both government and social scene, and Charles II is a king who understands the power of being seen in relaxed, approachable ways, even if those relaxed spaces are politically strategic. Charles also brings an increased emphasis on comfort and fashionable domestic design. The 17th century in general sees evolving ideas about privacy and interior space. Royal apartments become more refined. Decorative schemes matter. Gardens become deliberate statements, designed for walking, conversation, controlled display. The royal home is also a place of scientific curiosity. This is the age of new institutions and new thinking, and court life intersects with that world. Objects, instruments, and ideas circulate through palace rooms. Yet the old medieval palace problem remains. Whitehall is sprawling and chaotic, built up over centuries. It is magnificent, but it is also a fire risk waiting to happen. Charles II's domestic world sets the tone for later Stuart monarchy. The palace as social engine, the household as political network. But the glitter is always shadowed by religious tension and succession anxiety. And speaking of anxiety, James II will inhabit these same spaces with a sense of tightening crisis until the royal home itself becomes a kind of doorway through which a new dynasty walks. James II and the palace at the edge of revolution. James II becomes king in 1685, and the domestic geography of monarchy is thick with tension. Whitehall remains central, and other royal residences remain in use, but the atmosphere is charged by the king's Catholicism and the political fear surrounding it. In a palace, fear is rarely loud. It is whispered. It is the way courtiers watch each other, the way officials choose words carefully, the way rumors move through corridors faster than servants carrying trays. James's reign sees increasing opposition, and the court becomes a place where loyalty is measured constantly. Religious issues shape domestic life. Chapel use, ceremonial choices, the king's household appointments. Then comes 1688, the Glorious Revolution, and the arrival of William of Orange. The monarchy changes hands with an astonishing speed, and royal residences become the settings for that transfer of power. Imagine the surreal domestic experience of revolution. Rooms occupied by one court and then suddenly another. Servants adapting, officials switching, guards reassigned. The palace is still the palace, but the faces inside change, and that change becomes history. James II's departure turns royal home into a symbol of legitimacy again. Whoever occupies the palace is the ruler. Architecture becomes proof. And speaking of proof, William III and Mary II will take royal residence in a new direction, away from the chaotic sprawl of Whitehall and toward a different kind of domestic ideal, the modern palace. William III, Mary II, and the rise of Kensington Palace. When William III and Mary II take the throne after 1688, they inherit not only a kingdom but a set of palaces that don't quite fit their needs. Whitehall is still the great London residence, but it is sprawling, unhealthy, and difficult to manage. The new monarch's domestic choices reflect something changing in royal life, an increasing desire for privacy, comfort, and a residence designed more coherently than the medieval tangle of rooms and corridors. Kensington Palace becomes the emblem of this shift. Originally a country house, it is adapted into a royal residence. close enough to London for governance but far enough to offer cleaner air. An important concern for William's health, Kensington is more modern in feel, a place you can redesign with intention, gardens you can shape, apartments you can organize. Hampton Court is also transformed under William and Mary, with new building works and grand Baroque elements that reflect continental tastes. The palace becomes a statement of legitimacy and sophistication, a way of signaling that the post-revolution monarchy is not merely surviving, it is stylishly stable. Imagine Kensington in this period: new apartments, a quieter domestic rhythm than Whitehall's chaos, gardens laid out with geometry and control. The royal home begins to feel less like a medieval fortress and more like a designed environment. Yet the monarchy still needs ceremonial spaces. Westminster remains essential for Parliament and coronations. The Tower of London remains symbolically potent, but the daily domestic heart begins to shift toward places like Kensington, smaller, cleaner, more controllable. This is the monarchy learning to live differently, not just ruling differently, but dwelling differently. And speaking of dwelling, disaster will soon reshape royal residence more dramatically than any taste or health concern. The fire that will destroy Whitehall as a palace home forever. The Great Fire of Whitehall and the loss of a royal world. Whitehall Palace had been the principal residence of English monarchs for generations, an enormous complex, full of offices, lodgings, chapels, galleries, and the constant bustle of a court that never fully slept. But in 1698, most of Whitehall is destroyed by fire. This is not merely an architectural loss. It is the end of a particular style of royal domestic life. Whitehall was a city within a city, a place where the monarchy and government lived tangled together. Its destruction forces a shift. The court must adapt, spreading more decisively into other residences. Only the banqueting house survives, standing like a fragment of the old world. Still monumental, still symbolic, but now separated from the everyday domestic life it once anchored. Imagine the aftermath: charred beams, collapsed roofs, the smell of smoke lingering in a place that had been the center of England's political home life, officials scrambling to relocate, courtiers finding new lodgings, the monarchy's domestic geography rearranged by catastrophe. After Whitehall, the Crown's primary London area homes rely more on Kensington, St. James's Palace, and later, Buckingham House. Hampton Court remains important, though the court will gradually drift away from it as London's pull grows stronger. This fire accelerates a long change. The monarchy and government begin to separate spatially. Westminster becomes more purely governmental. The royal home becomes more private, more domestic, even as it remains political. And speaking of private, Queen Anne will bring the court's domestic heart into a new arrangement, leaning into certain palaces, while the early modern monarchy continues to redefine what home even means. Queen Anne and the court between Kensington and St. James's. Queen Anne becomes monarch in 1702, and her reign's domestic geography reflects both continuity and gradual change. Kensington Palace remains significant, still carrying the legacy of William and Mary's shift toward healthier, more manageable living. St. James's Palace, older, Tudor-rooted, serves as a key London residence and court center. Hampton Court continues to exist as a royal palace, used and maintained, but the gravitational pull of London grows more intense. The monarchy's relationship to the city becomes closer and more constant, especially as the political life of Parliament expands. Anne's domestic life is marked by personal tragedy, multiple pregnancies, losses, the absence of a surviving heir, and that personal sorrow what affects the tone of residence. Yes, palaces can be full of people yet shadowed by private grief. Rooms that hosted celebrations can become reminders of loss. Imagine Anne moving through Kensington's apartments, the echo of footsteps in a corridor, the quiet weight of a household trying to maintain ceremonial brightness, while the Queen carries grief like an invisible cloak. Her reign also sees the 1707 Act of Union that creates Great Britain, expanding the monarchy's symbolic scope. Yet home remains stubbornly local, rooted in London's palaces, in the familiar domestic spaces where the Queen eats, prays, meets ministers. The court under Anne retains ceremony but also feels increasingly shaped by politics as party systems develop. The royal residence becomes a place where ministers matter more, where the monarch's household must accommodate the growing machinery of parliamentary government. And speaking of machinery, when the Hanoverians arrive, the royal home becomes a place of cultural translation again, as foreign-born kings inhabit English palaces with varying levels of enthusiasm. George III and the foreign court in London palaces. George III becomes king in 1714, arriving from Hanover, and his domestic relationship to British royal residences carries a sense of distance. He is not raised inside these palaces. He inherits them as tools, as stages, as necessities. St. James's Palace becomes central to court life, serving as the main ceremonial residence in London for much of the early Hanoverian period. Kensington remains in use. Hampton Court continues as a royal palace, though the court's constant presence there diminishes over time. George III's household must adjust. Language, customs, personal preferences. The palace becomes a space of translation, both literal and cultural. Ministers and courtiers learn how to navigate a monarch who may feel more at home elsewhere. Imagine St. James's with a slightly altered atmosphere. The familiar Tudor brick exterior and old corridors, hosting a court that includes new faces and foreign influences. The social choreography shifts subtly. Who gets close? Who matters? Who can communicate effectively? These become new power dynamics. George's reign is also significant for the growing role of ministers and the development of what we recognize as cabinet government. As monarchs become less personally engaged in daily governance, the home begins to feel more ceremonial and less administrative. Westminster's political life grows. The palace becomes more about court than state. Yet the palace still matters because monarchy is still embodied. The king's presence in a room can still shape careers. The household still consumes resources. The architecture still announces hierarchy. And speaking of hierarchy, George II will bring a more domestically engaged court life, and with him we begin to see the slow rise of a building that will eventually eclipse St. James's Buckingham House. George II and the court's gradual shift. George II becomes king in 1727, and his domestic life is more engaged with court routines than his father's had been. St. James's Palace remains the primary official court center still, hosting ceremonies, receptions, and the formal life of monarchy. Kensington remains important as a residence, and Hampton Court continues to exist as a kind of royal backdrop used, maintained, but increasingly peripheral to the daily core of monarchy. Windsor remains a significant royal property, though not yet the dominant symbol it will become later. This is also the period when Buckingham House, then a private townhouse built for the Duke of Buckingham, starts entering the royal orbit through purchase and use by the royal family later in the century. It is not yet Buckingham Palace, but the seed is there, the idea of a newer, more adaptable London residence. Imagine George II's domestic world as one of layered tradition. St. James's feels old, Tudor corridors, accumulated history, yet the court continues to treat it as the proper setting for ceremony. The monarchy is living inside its own past. The Georgian period also brings new tastes in architecture and gardens, more emphasis on restraint, classical forms, ordered landscapes. The royal home begins to incorporate these sensibilities, even within older structures. But the deeper shift is political. The monarchy's practical governance role continues to recede in favor of ministers and parliament. The domestic home becomes less the seat of administration and more the emblem of continuity. It must represent stability, even if it is not the engine of policy. And speaking of engines, George III will make the royal home feel intensely personal again, not because he reclaims all political power, but because his domestic choices reflect family morality and the complicated human reality of mental illness. George III and the family home. Ideal George III becomes king in 1760, and his domestic identity becomes famously family-oriented, at least in contrast to certain earlier Hanoverian reputations. This affects royal residence. The monarchy begins to emphasize a quieter, more respectable domestic image. The king as husband, father, moral center. St. James's remains the official court setting for certain ceremonies, but Buckingham House becomes a key residence after George III acquires it for Queen Charlotte in 1761. It gains the nickname the Queen's House, reflecting its role as a family home rather than merely a court stage. Kew also becomes important, particularly Kew Palace, associated with the royal family's private life. Windsor remains significant, increasingly used as a refuge and residence away from the city. Imagine the difference in domestic atmosphere between St. James's and Buckingham House. St. James's is official, ceremonial, older. Buckingham House is more adaptable, more intimate in scale, better suited to a family household and a domestic image of monarchy. George III's reign also contains the painful reality of his mental illness, which shapes the meaning of home. Royal residences become spaces of care, containment, and political tension. During periods when the king is unwell, access becomes controlled. The private apartments become charged with national importance. Imagine the quiet rooms where physicians and attendants manage the king's condition, while outside, ministers and family members worry about governance and succession. The palace becomes a place where personal health becomes constitutional crisis. George III's domestic world also spans enormous historical change. War with America, revolution in France, industrial transformation. The royal home becomes, paradoxically, a refuge of tradition amid modern upheaval. And speaking of upheaval, George IV will transform royal residence again, turning home into spectacle, indulgence, and architectural fantasy. George III and the Age of Palace Fantasies. George I as Prince Regent and then as King in 1820 is a monarch whose domestic legacy is inseparable from architecture and taste. Under him, royal homes become extravagant, statements, some brilliant, some outrageous, all designed to impress. The most famous is the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, transformed into an astonishing fantasy of domes and exotic-inspired interiors. It functions as a pleasure palace, a theatrical escape from London and the weight of politics. It is home as mood, indulgent, flamboyant, intentionally unreal. In London, Buckingham House is transformed into Buckingham Palace through major rebuilding and expansion. The monarchy's central residence begins to take the shape we recognize today, though it will continue to evolve. Windsor Castle is also dramatically renovated and expanded under George IV, becoming a grand symbol of monarchy rooted in history. The medieval fortress is reshaped into something Gothic and monumental, an architectural claim that the crown is ancient, majestic, and still relevant. Imagine the domestic atmosphere of these projects. New rooms, new decorative schemes, endless building works, servants, adapting to changing spaces, the monarchy spending enormous sums to craft an image in stone and plaster. George IV's residences reveal a monarchy increasingly concerned with representation. In an era of political reform pressure and social change, the palace becomes a way to insist on grandeur. If authority is questioned in Parliament and the press, it can still be asserted visually through architecture. Yet there's also fragility here. The splendor can feel like compensation, like armor made of velvet. And speaking of armor, William IV will inherit these spaces with a very different temperament, bringing a more restrained domestic approach to palaces built for theatricality. William IV and the shift toward a more practical court. William IV becomes king in 1830, and his domestic relationship to royal residences is noticeably different from George IV's. Where George lavished attention on spectacle, William's reputation leans more practical, sometimes even blunt. This affects how the royal home feels, at least in mood, even if the architecture remains grand. Buckingham Palace is in the process of becoming the main royal residence in London, though it is not yet the smooth, perfected symbol it will later become. There are practical issues, space, design problems, and the sheer challenge of turning an enlarged townhouse into a functioning palace for a modern monarchy. St. James's Palace still holds ceremonial importance as a court center for certain functions, even as Buckingham rises. Windsor remains significant, newly transformed into a grand historic monument of monarchy. Yet William's court is less about theatrical display and more about the working reality of being king in an age of reform. The Reform Act of 1832 reshapes British politics, and the monarchy's domestic spaces are increasingly surrounded by public debate and press scrutiny. Imagine the palace in this era as slightly unsettled, beautiful rooms but practical frustrations, household adjusting to new expectations, a monarch who may not relish the endless performance of grandeur. The royal home becomes less a stage for a single personality and more an institution that must function under modern attention. William's reign also hints at a deeper transformation. The monarchy is becoming more public in a new way. The palace is still private space, but it exists under the gaze of newspapers, caricatures, and a growing public appetite for royal domestic detail. And speaking of detail, Victoria will make royal homes feel emotionally central again, turning certain residences into symbols of family grief and the modern monarchy's intimate myth. Victoria and the emotional geography of monarchy. Queen Victoria becomes monarch in 1837, and her reign reshapes the meaning of royal home, perhaps more profoundly than any since the Tudors. Under Victoria, the monarchy's domestic life becomes part of its public identity, family-centered, morally framed, intensely emotional. Buckingham Palace becomes the main London residence, and the visible symbol of monarchy in the capital. It is where crowds gather, where ceremonies unfold, where the sovereign is both present and distant behind gates and balconies. Windsor Castle becomes a beloved home, used extensively and associated with family life as well as state occasions. Under Victoria and Prince Albert, it is further adapted into a comfortable residence within its grand historic shell. But the most emotionally charged royal homes of Victoria's reign are the private retreats, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight and Balmoral Castle in Scotland. These are not merely residences, they are statements about the monarchy's desire for private family space, away from court pressures. Osborne, built in an Italianate style, becomes a cherished family home, associated with seaside air and domestic routine. Balmoral becomes the symbol of a romanticized Highland retreat, shaping the monarchy's relationship to Scotland in the popular imagination. Imagine Victoria's domestic world across these places. Buckingham Palace is official, busy, ceremonial, crowded with politics. Windsor is both official and familial. Osborne is intimate, children, routines, domestic comfort. Balmoral is landscape, fresh air, hills, a crafted image of rugged simplicity supported by immense resources. Then comes 1861. Prince Albert dies, and Victoria's relationship to home changes into a map of grief. Osborne and Balmoral become refuges. Windsor becomes a place of mourning. Buckingham, for long periods, becomes less inhabited, its public role continuing even as the Queen withdraws. Imagine empty rooms at Buckingham, curtains drawn, the palace functioning as a symbol while the sovereign lives elsewhere. The domestic choice becomes political controversy because the monarchy's home is expected to be visibly occupied. Victoria's reign demonstrates how royal residences can become emotional monuments. A palace can hold not just power but memory. And speaking of memory, Edward VII will inherit these spaces and bring court life back into them with a different tone, sociable, modern, and distinctly early 20th century. Edward VII and the return of society to the palaces. Edward VII becomes king in 1901, after a long time as Prince of Wales, and his domestic style is shaped by sociability. After Victoria's long mourning, the court becomes lively again. Royal residences regain a sense of public glitter. Buckingham Palace becomes the center of London court life, hosting receptions, dinners, and the ceremonial rhythms of a monarchy that is now deeply embedded in modern media and social networks. Marlborough House, Edward's longtime London home as prince, remains associated with his social world, though as king he occupies the palaces of state. Windsor continues as a major residence, used for both state and leisure. Sandringham, a private estate in Norfolk, purchased by Edward when he was Prince of Wales, becomes a deeply personal home, a place associated with family life and countryside retreat. Sandringham is a reminder that modern monarchs increasingly have private homes distinct from their state palaces. Imagine the domestic differences. Buckingham, formal and grand; Windsor, historic and expansive; Sandringham, private, more comfortable in a country house way, designed for relaxation, hunting, family routine. Edward's reign is also a period of increasing international diplomacy and royal networking. Palaces become settings for global visitors, kings, emperors, diplomats, moving through rooms designed to impress. The royal home becomes a tool of soft power, hospitality as politics. A banquet is not just dinner, it is strategy served on silver. And speaking of strategy, George V will take the monarchy through war and upheaval, and in that era the royal home becomes both a refuge and a public symbol of endurance. George V and the monarchy in a time of war. George V becomes king in 1910, and his reign is defined by crisis and transformation, most dramatically the First World War. The royal residences in this period must do more than house a family. They must embody national steadiness. Buckingham Palace remains the central London residence, the visible symbol of monarchy. During wartime, its role becomes deeply public, receiving wounded soldiers, hosting morale-boosting events, representing continuity. Windsor becomes even more significant as a residence, offering both security and a sense of historic solidity. Sandringham remains a private retreat. Balmoral continues as the Scottish home. These private residences matter because they allow the royal family to maintain domestic stability amid national trauma. Imagine Buckingham Palace during war, the guarded gates, the changing mood of the city, the palace functioning as a symbolic anchor while the world feels unstable. The domestic inside, family, meals, routines, takes on meaning because it suggests normality surviving. This period also includes the monarchy's name change from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor in 1917, driven by anti-German sentiment. That change is domestic in a strange way. The royal home becomes the royal identity. Windsor, a castle, becomes a surname, turning architecture into political camouflage and national branding. George V's reign shows how residence and identity intertwine. A home can become a flag. And speaking of flags, Edward V's brief reign will show how quickly a monarch can leave those homes behind, turning palaces into backdrops for abdication. Edward V and the palace as a place you leave. Edward VIII becomes king in 1936, and his reign ends the same year with abdication. In domestic terms, the story is startling. A king who does not fully settle into his royal homes before giving them up. Buckingham Palace is the primary symbol, of course, but Edward's short reign means that the palace remains more an institutional setting than a deeply inhabited home. The monarchy's domestic rhythm is disrupted by the constitutional crisis surrounding his desire to marry Wallis Simpson. Imagine the atmosphere within palace walls during this crisis. Tension in meetings, controlled conversation, the weight of tradition pressing against personal desire. A royal residence becomes a place where private life cannot be separated from national expectation. When Edward abdicates, the palaces remain, but the person changes. The rooms don't care who wears the crown. They wait. And speaking of waiting, George VI will inhabit these spaces during the Second World War, when royal home becomes not just symbol but target. George VI in Buckingham Palace under fire. George VI becomes king in 1936 and leads the monarchy through the Second World War. The domestic geography of royal life becomes intensely meaningful because the danger becomes physical. Buckingham Palace is bombed during the Blitz, and that fact reverberates. The royal home shares risk with the city. Buckingham remains the central London residence, and the King and Queen's decision to be seen there, despite danger, becomes part of wartime symbolism. Windsor becomes a crucial residence as well, serving as a safer base. The royal family spends significant time there, including safeguarding the princesses. Imagine the domestic atmosphere at Windsor during wartime. Blackouts, security, the hush of precaution, yet also routine. Lessons, meals, family conversations, trying to maintain a sense of normal life. Buckingham, meanwhile, carries the drama of resilience. Damaged rooms, broken windows, the smell of dust after blasts. The palace as a building becomes a participant in the war narrative. This era also emphasizes the monarchy's public role. Royal homes become settings for speeches, morale-building appearances, and carefully managed displays of unity. The domestic becomes national. Theater again, but now the theater is built on shared danger. George VI's reign shows that palaces can be vulnerable, and that vulnerability can create connection. And speaking of connection, Elizabeth II will reign for decades, and during that time, royal homes will become a network, places for ceremony, work, retreat, and, eventually, public reckoning. Elizabeth II and the network of modern royal homes. Elizabeth II becomes queen in 1952, and by the time her reign is properly underway, the royal home is no longer one place. It is a network, each residence carrying a different job, a different mood, a different relationship with the public. If earlier monarchs ruled from halls that doubled as kitchens, courts, and sleeping quarters, Elizabeth inherits a world where the crown's domestic life is also a brand, a workplace, and, unavoidably, a story people expect to watch. Buckingham Palace becomes the primary London home and the most visible symbol of monarchy. It is where crowds gather, where state visits are hosted, where balcony moments turn into national ritual. Inside, the building must perform two roles at once: private family residence and ceremonial machine, with staff and schedules and rooms that are lived in only in carefully managed ways. Windsor Castle becomes the great alternative heart, historic, defensible, emotionally resonant, and increasingly central over the decades. It is both a working royal residence and a place the monarchy can retreat into when London feels too loud. Its scale helps. Windsor can absorb huge state occasions, but it can also hold private domestic routine behind layers of stone and distance. Then there are the private country homes that define the rhythm of the year. Sandringham, associated with Christmas, feels like a tradition made architectural. Family gatherings, familiar rooms, the same walks, repeated until they become part of memory. Balmoral, the summer home in Scotland, becomes synonymous with a different kind of royal domestic identity: landscape, privacy, long days, and a carefully cultivated image of simplicity, supported by a very large staff and a very old institution. And there are other key residences that quietly hold the monarchy's geography together. Holyrood House in Edinburgh, for example, providing a formal Scottish home in the capital, and the long-standing ceremonial weight of places like St. James's Palace, which continues to host certain court functions even as it ceases to be the main royal household center. In Elizabeth II's reign, home becomes a schedule, a London season, a weekend at Windsor, Christmas at Sandringham, summer at Balmoral. Each place isn't just a building, it's a signal, where the monarch tells you what mode the crown is operating in: public ceremony, constitutional routine, or guarded private life. And speaking of guarded, modern monarchy changes the feeling of residence itself, because the biggest threat is no longer a rival army outside the walls. It's attention, endless, hungry, unblinking attention. Buckingham Palace and the public home. Buckingham Palace is often described as if it's a single stable thing. One facade, one balcony, one neat idea of royal life. But as a home, it's more like a layered organism. There are staterooms designed to impress and overwhelm, corridors designed to manage movement, offices designed to keep the institution functional, and private apartments that are both real domestic space and carefully protected boundary. In Elizabeth II's early decades, the palace becomes a symbol of post-war continuity. It hosts ceremonies that reassure, state visits that project Britain outward, and routines that make the monarchy feel dependable. The domestic is framed as duty. Even leisure carries a sense of schedule. Imagine the palace from the inside on an ordinary working day. Staff moving with practiced quiet. Doors opening and closing in an order most visitors never see. The smell of polished wood and flowers arranged with precision. Phones ringing in offices far from the gilded rooms tourists imagine. The steady pressure of expectation. The building must look timeless, even as it constantly needs repair, renovation, and modernization. And modernity changes how home behaves. In the age of television, Buckingham Palace becomes a set. Cameras, lighting, broadcast moments. Each one turns a private institution into a national living room event. The monarchy's domestic spaces become part of public consumption, whether the family wants that or not. Even the palace gates become a kind of threshold between worlds. Outside, crowds press ceremony. Inside, an ancient routine of staff, paperwork, and measured appearances. The balcony itself becomes a ritual edge, where the private family becomes a public symbol for a few minutes, then retreats again behind stone and glass. If medieval kings used their hall to gather loyalty under one roof, Buckingham Palace gathers loyalty under a lens. Home becomes a performance that must look effortless. And speaking of effortlessness, Windsor offers a different kind of domestic strength. The comfort of endurance, the feeling of a place that has survived so much it almost seems impossible to move. Windsor Castle and the feeling of shelter. Windsor Castle has always been significant, but across Elizabeth II's reign, it becomes something more emotionally central, partly because it is so old, and partly because it can hold the monarchy's contradictions in one place. It is fortress and home, museum and workplace, medieval stone and modern wiring hidden behind panels. Windsor is where the monarchy can feel less exposed. Even when it hosts state occasions, the building's scale and layout create layers of separation. The long drive, the walls, the gates, the geography itself, all of it slows the world down before it reaches the private rooms. Imagine arriving at Windsor in the evening. The light catches stone that has watched centuries pass. The air feels different than London's, less crowded, less urgent. Inside, there are rooms that can host glittering dinners, and corridors that can be almost monastic in their quiet when the visitors have gone. Windsor's role becomes especially apparent during moments of national strain and private royal crisis. When the monarchy needs solidity, Windsor offers it. When the family needs privacy, Windsor offers it. When the institution needs history as armor, Windsor offers it in every arch and staircase. Then comes 1992, a year often remembered as a turning point in the emotional narrative of the monarchy. And within that year, Windsor becomes not just a shelter, but a reminder that even ancient homes are vulnerable. A great fire at Windsor damages significant parts of the castle. The event is physical: flames, smoke, ruined rooms. But it is also symbolic. If Windsor can burn, then nothing is entirely protected. Restoration becomes an act of institutional self-repair. rebuilding rooms, reasserting continuity, proving that the monarchy can endure visible damage and still stand. Windsor's restoration also contributes to a modern shift, opening certain royal spaces more widely to the public, allowing visitors to help fund repair, turning parts of the royal home into a kind of shared heritage site. The home becomes, in part, a public resource. And speaking of public resources, Sandringham and Balmoral represent the opposite mood: private ritual, seasonal rhythm, the monarchy at its most domestic and least performative, even when the world is watching from the hedgerows. Sandringham and the ritual of Christmas Sandringham in Norfolk is one of those royal homes that feels almost like a family tradition turned into bricks and carpets. It is privately owned and deeply associated with Christmas, an annual domestic ritual that has become part of how the monarchy narrates itself. In the public imagination, Sandringham is about familiarity, the same church walk, the same clustered family arrivals, the sense of a household that, however strange its privileges, still performs a recognizably human holiday routine. But that familiarity is also a careful arrangement. Security, staff planning, controlled public visibility. Even private homes at this level are orchestrated. Imagine the domestic texture: a large house warmed against winter, the smell of fires and food, the quiet busyness of staff preparing rooms, the rhythm of meals that must accommodate hierarchy without making it feel too obvious. The setting is rural, which helps the illusion of calm, yet every detail is logistical. Sandringham also carries memory. Over decades, it becomes a place where generations repeat the same gestures until they become tradition. And tradition for monarchy is not merely nostalgia. It is legitimacy softened into ritual. When Elizabeth II is there, Sandringham becomes a backdrop for continuity. The house is not meant to be new or spectacular. It is meant to be steady. The monarchy's home here is less about grandeur and more about repetition, the comfort of doing something the same way year after year as the world changes. And speaking of change, Balmoral represents a different kind of repetition: summer rather than winter, landscape rather than ceremony, and a particular royal relationship with Scotland that blends genuine affection with carefully maintained symbolism. Balmoral in the summer of distance. Balmoral in Aberdeenshire is often spoken of with a hush, as if it is the place where the monarchy breathes. It is privately owned, it sits in vast landscape, and it has become inseparable from the royal story of retreat. In domestic terms, Balmoral is about distance, not only physical distance from London, but emotional distance from constant ceremonial demand. The days stretch out. The air is sharper. The visual world is hills, trees, rivers, nature that makes the palace life feel smaller, or at least less crowded. Imagine the domestic rhythm of Balmoral: less state pageantry, more routine, walks, rides, quiet evenings. Staff still present, because staff is always present, but arranged to make the family's life feel more ordinary than it truly is. The house becomes a place where the monarchy can pretend, briefly, that it is just a family with a summer home. Yet Balmoral is also deeply symbolic. It represents a particular 19th century royal myth: the sovereign in the Highlands, the crown tied to landscape and tradition. Over Elizabeth II's reign, Balmoral becomes one of the most emotionally charged royal homes in the public mind because it is associated with private moments that later become public grief. The point is not to linger on sorrow, but to recognize the strange transformation modern monarchy undergoes. Private geography becomes public narrative. A summer home becomes part of national, emotional life. In earlier centuries, monarchs could mourn behind walls and let rumor do the rest. In the late 20th century, the world expects visibility, statement, choreography. Even the most private home is not fully private. And speaking of choreography, modern royal homes have to function under the pressure of media and security in a way medieval kings never imagined. The architecture isn't just walls now, it's a system. The modern royal home as security system. By the second half of the 20th century, royal residence is shaped by something quiet but constant: security. Not the medieval kind, no siege towers, no arrow slits used in anger, but the modern kind: controlled access, surveillance, planning, and an awareness that the threat might come in a letter, a camera, a lone intruder, or a crowd. This changes the feeling of home. A palace is no longer simply an environment you live in. It is an environment managed, monitored, and reinforced. Private apartments exist within layers of protection. Staff routines become security routines. Even the domestic act of leaving a building, walking to a car, stepping onto a plane, becomes part of an institutional choreography. Imagine the subtle, domestic consequences: doors that require certain keys, corridors that are quiet because certain routes are restricted, windows that can't be opened the way they used to be, a home where the outside world is always present as a consideration, even when nobody is physically there. This also affects how royal residences are renovated and maintained. Modern wiring, modern communications, modern safety measures, all must be added to old buildings without breaking the illusion of timelessness. A medieval castle must quietly contain the infrastructure of a modern state-adjacent institution. And the more the monarchy tries to maintain a boundary between private and public, the more the public becomes curious about what lies behind it. The royal home becomes both protected and irresistible. In Elizabeth II's reign, the monarchy learns to manage this attention through controlled openness, televised tours, carefully framed images, selective access. The home becomes partly shared, but on the monarchy's terms. And speaking of terms, by the end of Elizabeth's reign, the royal home is also shaped by conversations about cost, relevance, and what the monarchy should look like in a modern society. The buildings are old. The expectations are new. Elizabeth II and the lasting idea of duty in stone. Across 7 decades, Elizabeth II's relationship to royal residence becomes one of continuity above all. Her homes are not only places she lives, they are places the monarchy uses to express stability, especially in times when everything else feels unstable. Buckingham Palace remains the public face. Ceremonies, state visits, the steady rhythm of constitutional monarchy. Windsor becomes the emotional anchor, endurance, refuge, the sense of a home that can hold both celebration and grief. Sandringham becomes ritual, the seasonality of monarchy turned into family tradition. Balmoral becomes privacy, the place where the crown's domestic life seems most human even when it is watched. By the end, the network of royal homes feels like a map of roles. Each residence has a function. Each function has its own atmosphere. The monarchy is less an itinerant medieval household and more an institution with multiple headquarters, each carefully maintained as part of the crown's identity. Elizabeth's reign makes one final point about home in monarchy. The building can become larger than the person. A palace can outlast a lifetime and still carry that lifetime's imprint, as if memory settles into wallpaper. And then, inevitably, the crown passes. A new monarch walks into rooms that feel familiar to the nation and must decide what to keep, what to change, and how to live inside an inheritance made of stone, staff, and expectation. And speaking of inheritance, Charles III's home story is shaped by modern pressures, environmental concerns, public scrutiny, and the question of how to slim down an institution without hollowing it out. Charles III and the home as a modernized institution. Charles III becomes king in 2022, and he inherits not only palaces, but a modern conversation about what those palaces mean. The residences remain the same great landmarks: Buckingham Palace as the principal London symbol, Windsor as the historic stronghold and deeply significant home, and the private estates like Sandringham and Balmoral carrying personal and familial weight. But the tone shifts. Charles's long public identity includes a focus on architecture, heritage, environment, and a certain impatience with waste. That doesn't mean monarchy becomes simple. Nothing about monarchy is simple. But it does mean the royal home is increasingly discussed in terms of function, sustainability, and public perception. Buckingham Palace continues as the central stage for the crown's public life, but it is also a building in constant need of modernization and repair. Its scale is immense, and modern expectations, safety, energy efficiency, accessibility, press against the reality of an old structure designed for a different era. Windsor remains central, offering both grandeur and the kind of privacy that modern monarchs still need to survive. The castle's historic aura continues to serve the monarchy as a visual argument. This institution has roots, it has survived, it belongs. At the same time, Charles's reign begins with heightened awareness that royal residences are not only homes, they are symbols of inequality to some, heritage to others, tourist magnets, workplaces, and constitutional backdrops. Every repair, every staffing decision, every public opening of a room can be read as a statement. Imagine the domestic challenge of being a modern monarch, trying to live in a place that is also a national emblem, trying to make private life feel real in rooms that are constantly interpreted, trying to modernize without erasing the very history that gives the monarchy its identity. Charles's home story, then, is not just about where he sleeps. It's about what kind of monarchy can inhabit these old walls now, and how those walls can be made to serve a 21st century institution without turning into a museum of itself. And speaking of museums, this is where our quiet tour begins to loop back on itself. Because once you've walked from smoky timber halls to gilded state rooms, you start to notice the repeating truth beneath all the architecture. Monarchy lives in rooms, but it is made out of movement, between public and private, between fear and display, between shelter and stage. Now, as the lights go lower and the century noise softens, let's take one last slow look back down the corridor we've just walked. From Alfred's guarded centers to the Norman fortress home, from the restless circuits of the Angevin kings to Westminster's vast ceremonial hall, the royal home keeps changing shape, but it keeps keeping the same secret. A monarch's home is never only a home. It's a signal. It says who is safe, who is welcome, who is favored, who is watched. It can be a feast and a threat in the same room. It can be a chapel where legitimacy is prayed into stone, and an office where legitimacy is stamped into wax. It can be a nursery that becomes a government, a bedchamber that becomes a constitutional crisis, a banquet hall that becomes an execution's backdrop. And when the buildings grow grander, Hampton Court swelling into a world of kitchens and corridors, Whitehall turning into a city of power, Buckingham becoming a stage for a whole nation, the human pattern underneath doesn't disappear. It just gets better lighting. The same questions remain. Who gets access? Who pays the costs? Who gets to rest? And who has to perform? If you remember one thing from this quiet tour, let it be this. British history isn't only written in battles and laws. It's written in rooms, in thresholds, in the distance between a public staircase and a private door, in the way Windsor can feel like shelter and the Tower can feel like a trap, in the way Sandringham repeats tradition like a lullaby, while Westminster and Buckingham keep the machinery of state humming behind velvet curtains. So, wherever you are listening from, bed, train, late-night kitchen, imagine those old residences settling back into the dark, fires banked, tapestries still, corridors emptying. Monarchs come and go, dynasties rise, fracture, rename themselves, reinvent themselves, and the houses remain, reshaped, repaired, burned, rebuilt, quietly holding the imprint of every anxious meeting, every careful performance, every private grief carried down a hallway no one was supposed to see. And if you'd like, next time, we can do another slow walk through royal scandals, forgotten laws, or the hidden machinery that kept the empire running while the palaces glittered. For now, let the doors close gently, let the footsteps fade, and let history finally go quiet.